So thanks, guys, for coming. We've got a Dave and a David. My grandfather's name was Dave, but I'm a Howard. And all three of us, near as I can tell, are what I would call music junkies or addicts. Somehow, at an early age, it appears that each of the three of us discovered that music had a lot of impact on us. And we kind of grabbed onto it, and not just music, sound also. And we didn't let go. And our combined age is over 200. So 200 man-years later, we're still on that groove somehow. And since this program is called Harvesting Infinity, I've come to the conclusion that harvesting infinity and innovation and adapting, they're all related, but they do require a lot of flexibility. And both of these guys are very, very creative and very, very flexible. And part of what I want to find out is how, when they thought they were going to do one thing and then a different thing happened, how their flexibility allowed them to sort of keep on staying in the groove that they wanted to be in. So I'll let you kind of introduce yourselves more within the context of the stories that you tell about how you ended up where you are. But we do represent three different sort of musical backgrounds. We all love jazz, but David is classically trained and Dave is jazz trained, and I'm mostly self-taught, but we all still improvise. So we're all kind of jazz oriented no matter what our backgrounds. And we actually do even represent three different institutions: New England Conservatory and Berklee College of Jazz and Juilliard. So we have lots of training, but I don't know how much it has to do with what we're doing. So let's just start with Dave. You must have, when you started out as a musician, had some sort of mental map of what you thought you might be doing, and probably a very different thing happened. Like,
oh, I was going to be a rock star.
Oh, me too.
But Howard, thank you for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks.
I started on piano at age 8, and there was a piano in the house. My mom played piano. My sisters played piano. It was just kind of expected, and at that point, I really didn't have much of a map. I didn't have much of an idea as to what the future might hold. It was a rough start, piano at 8, trumpet at 9, and then I left piano after about a year of classical traditional lessons, and it really wasn't for me. But then came back to it at around 14. And got more interested and more serious and started playing more popular music, and then eventually into jazz. And that's when I had dreams of being a rock star, at age 14 or so. But as far as having a mental map of where I was going, other than that, I wanted to play. I found that I loved doing it. I loved performing, and I loved the feedback that you'd get from the instrument, piano, or from the audience, while I was performing.
And was this in New York?
I grew up in New Jersey, right outside of New York City. So, this was all, in that metropolitan area.
Big music market.
Big music market, yeah. Eventually, I went to Boston, which, was a big awakening, Berklee College of Music. I was surrounded, I was, pretty hot stuff in high school. I was like one of 2 piano players, and, I got to Berklee, and I was like, I was way down here on the list of, talent, and I had to work hard to, hang tough and really, be, to get anywhere in that environment. But it was really inspiring. It was really motivating.
So in those 10 years between starting to play piano and then being at Berklee, you continued to move in a rock direction. So how did it switch to jazz?
Well, I got turned on to, I had an older brother, and he was about 5 years older than me. He went to college, and he came back with some, some influences that I hadn't been exposed to prior to that. Prior to that, it had been rock and pop, and, he turned me on to Jeff Beck. And Jeff Beck led me through the Wired album to Thelonious Monk, because he did a cover of Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. And that was kind of my pathway. The door didn't fully open up until I actually got to Berklee and I started studying and listening and learning more. I did play in jazz band in high school as well, but didn't really get a good handle on it until, I got to Berklee.
And Jeff Beck died not that long ago.
Yeah, an icon, one of the greats.
Big loss.
Yeah.
So you also did the New York and Boston circuit too.
Well, yes. I went to high school on Long Island, and very similar story, different circumstances, but I wanted to be the world's greatest jazz drummer when I was in high school, and that's what I was. I was a percussion major in college, and then Miles Davis came out with this new group with this 17-year-old drummer named Tony Williams, and I said, "Oh man, I could practice for the rest of my life, and would be no competition." So in college, I got interested in. They taught music theory and composition and all that stuff. So I was in the classical music department, and started playing timpani in the orchestra. And fell in love with that. So that was my kind of my niche for a while, as being pretty good timpanist, and did a lot of freelance work. But then, after years of working around in factories and all the part-time jobs that we take, applied to New England Conservatory as a conductor, choral conductor. Because I was also sang in the chorus, and it was the only thing I knew I could do. And it was one of those things where, for some reason, twist of fate, I got in, and studied choral conducting for a year, and then moved over to the orchestral conducting department. So I have a kind of a mixed degree in choral and orchestral conducting. And so they let you out at the end of 3 years, and they say, "Okay, go ahead, go find a life."
Yeah, it's about as easy as finding a gig as a jazz musician.
And I drove a taxi in Boston for several years. All right, yep. And had a little conducting community orchestra and that kind of thing in the Boston area. Did a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan anything you could find that would pay either nothing or $250 a year or something like that. You would just do, and I think that's kind of what you're hinting at, Howard. That musicians have to be resourceful, and they have to live on their willpower and their desire to keep going. And
that mental map of where you're going.
You don't know where it's going to go.
There is no map. You just there's a job here. I played piano for a ballerina school, for a ballet school when I was in Boston. I used to take the bus down to Roxbury, and for once an hour a week, I'd play piano for all these elementary school little girls that wanted to practice ballet. And then I played piano in a cafeteria where they gave me meals. And you just kind of follow the opportunities and where they lead you.
Yeah. So I too lived in New York and Boston. I was born in New York, but I ended up living in Boston for 10 years. And I had a slightly less straightforward path. I got a guitar when I was 6, and I couldn't really keep it in tune. And I discovered that guitars weren't actually perfectly in tune. And it turned out that it wasn't me, it was that there's a discontinuity between the 4 strings and the bottom 2 strings. Mm-hmm. So I kind of packed that in. And my parents bought a piano when I was 10, claiming that they both wanted to take piano lessons. And they got some Rodgers and Hammerstein books, and they each took one lesson. And I said, "Oh, could I take a lesson too?" And sort of before I realized that they stopped taking lessons and I was taking lessons. Mm. But my teacher quit in about 3 months because I had an annoying habit. Every time I got to a repeat sign, I played something different. And he constantly was slapping my wrists and saying, "You're making mistakes." I said, "No, I already played it right the first time. Now I get a turn." He said, "No, you're 10 years old. You don't get a turn." I said, "Well, why not? So here's what it says, and here's what I want to do. Could you explain to me why my notes are inferior to the ones that are on the page?" And he said, "I'm not going to have an existential conversation with a 10-year-old about the validity of individual notes." So my teacher quit. I didn't quit. The teacher quit and told my mother, "You should do something with him." But I can't do it. so I'm pretty much self-taught. Those were my 12 lessons.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And I continued to play anyway. But I wanted to be a photographer. But when I was about 15, a friend of mine had a cousin who was having a Sweet 16, and the bass player didn't show up. So her father said, well, Howard's musically capable. We'll teach him how to play bass. He already sort of knows how to play guitar and sort of knows how to play piano. So here's a bass, and put your finger over here. And I did that, and I discovered that having a whole room full of girls and playing bass was like way cooler than coming out of the dark room smelling like chemicals. And it was much better socially to be a bass player than to be a photographer. So I took all the money I saved up to build my silk screening outfit, and I bought a Dan Electro electric guitar for $15,
Wow.
which had STP stickers on it
Yeah.
and Formica, but my parents sort of put the kibosh on it. They said, you're going to starve to death as a musician, so we don't want you to be a music major in college. So I didn't listen, and for 2 years I was a music major. And I got positive feedback. Oh, you should be a composer. Like, you have a lot of ideas. And my parents said, don't give him any ideas. He's going to think he could he's going to end up living under a bridge and not be able to make a living. So I became an acoustician instead, because I thought sound was related to music. And so I stayed connected to it, but I kind of bailed on music for about 40 years. Except that I tried to play 3 gigs a month. And just like you got exposed, you were both bitten by the jazz bug. I liked the Grateful Dead and Acid and that whole scene, and it occurred to me that they were not playing the songs the same way every time. In fact, even if the same song on different albums was different. So it was the Grateful Dead that turned me on to jazz when I found out, there are actually like other people who do this at a higher level.
Oh, they're incredible improvisers. I also was a big Grateful Dead fan. I just heard this morning that they are going to be honored at the Kennedy Center Honors this year.
Yeah.
Grateful Dead. They're tremendous improvisers. And, while I was attending Berkeley, I was also going to Grateful Dead shows, just because you could go to 3 shows in a row and no 2 nights were the same. It was it was improvisation. It was, it was magical. They're good musicians.
I know one of them.
Do you?
One of the original, not one. I think he was original. One of the keyboard players, Tom Constantin.
Oh, yeah.
He lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I was for a while. And we both worked on some dance shows together. We were both composing and writing, putting our own music into these dance shows.
Yeah.
He's one of the brightest people I've ever met.
Oh.
Just a fund of incredible knowledge, and where he studied with, I think, Boulez, and went to Paris and studied. And he's still going strong. And he's probably 80 something now.
Yeah.
Did you like Mickey Hart as a percussionist?
Oh yeah. When he came out with all of those world music things, I just ate it all up. Yeah, I loved all that stuff. Yeah. Very
It's
much.
all good.
Boy, we can go down that path for an infinite amount of time, but I want to choose a different path at the moment. So during these many years we've been in this music world, and sometimes doing sound and sometimes doing music, a lot of things have changed. I mean, the way you perform, the way you prepare, how music is delivered, how you buy it, how it's recorded, how it's post-pro. Our whole world has changed really radically during our time. So do you have any thoughts about that? I know both of you would be perfectly content to be natural musicians with no technology at all, and you could have a great time. But I also know that neither one of you are afraid of technology, so you use it as well. And that's very interesting in terms of flexibility, because it's a gigantic universe.
I was kind of on the cutting edge of that transition. I left Berkeley in 1984, and when I moved back to New Jersey, New York metropolitan area, my first stop was on 48th Street. And I immediately went to every music store on 48th Street. It was the Mecca for music stores. And I got a job on 48th Street, selling musical instruments. And that was the time when the computers had just entered, digital technology had just entered the music world. That's when MIDI had just been introduced, drum machines had just been introduced, samplers. I was kind of right there and watched them come out. I remember, the first samplers that were huge, like the big emulators that cost $8,000 and could play just a couple of small snippets of sound. So I was learning on all of those tools as they were coming out, and that was my springboard to the next 20 plus years of my life working as a audio engineer, working in that world. I never left the music behind, but that transition from analog to digital, was really, it was fascinating, to see it all firsthand.
That's when the Mac just came out, around '84, I think.
Yeah.
It was the first.
I think the first Mac came out. But we were selling computers. We were selling Atari computers for music composition.
Atari.
We were selling the Commodore 64 for music composition.
Yeah.
All these old, antiques now. But they were cutting edge back in 1984, 1985.
Yeah, I was at Bose then in '84, and the company's IT department had a ban on anything that wasn't a PC. And I wanted to buy a Macintosh, so I didn't call it a computer. I put in a purchase order for a MIDI control appliance to control a Kurzweil K250. And it went through the purchasing department, and they allowed me to buy a Mac because they said I needed it to control the Kurzweil.
Right.
And so I was the only one who had a Mac, because they were against the rules. But at the time, we were using mini computers, and you would have 20 feet of manuals in your bookcases for like a Data General or a Prime. And I said, I could throw away all of these manuals and just intuitively play with this thing. And I got a really hard time. They said, you're supposed to be like a computer guy and a technical guy, and what do you mean you want to throw all the manuals away and just use this toy? This Macintosh is a toy. I said, I don't think so.
Yeah.
It's going to turn out to be really cool. So.
And it did. Yeah.
So what were you doing in '84?
Well,
What were you
in '84
doing?
I was well into trying to have a conducting career, which I managed to get from '84 into the '90s. And it was one of those things where be careful what you wish for, because I got into it and I was good at it, and I could see that I could be good at it, but I knew it was going to just take the juice right out of me. I mean, in terms of what it would take to advance in a career, and particularly in this country. And I was toying around with composing. I didn't study composition other than just theory and composition and standard courses. And something came up where the orchestra I was working with in Indiana, they were having a student composer project, and they invited in a composer from Colorado, and he was going to do all this stuff, working with kids. He was terrible. And I was the assistant conductor. I was kind of overseeing the program. And I was standing in the back of the room during one of these sessions. The kids were just so bored. And I said to the woman next to me, well, hell, I can do better than this. So she said, next year,
You just volunteered.
you're in. And so I said, oh, God, now I've got to write a piece for full orchestra and children's chorus, this happened to be. And I didn't have the first idea of how to do it, except to do it. Except I knew how orchestras worked, because I've been conducting for 15, 20 years. So I just did it. It came out fabulous. And everybody said, wow, this is terrific. You ought to be a composer.
Wow. Did you do that on paper and pencil? Or
And it was all on paper and pencil.
Wow.
And the first 2 or 3 works that I wrote were all this and, cut and paste. And I mean, really cut and paste.
Yeah.
And then somebody says, well, you should look into Finale, which I had just heard about. And this is around 1992, 93 probably, when Finale is just still in its 3.0.
Yeah, I was going to say that was Finale 3.0.
I think I bought the 3.0 books. I still have them.
Yeah.
They're, again, they take up a shelf. And went from there. And once, I got into that, I found it to be very helpful. As someone who hadn't done any composing and could hear textures and you could play something back, and you can correct the wrong notes before you take it to the first rehearsal. That's the big thing. It takes a lot of that out of it. So, and of course it's expanded. Exponentially from there. So.
Oh, nowadays it's insane.
Yeah.
You know, just about anybody can buy a computer and sit in their bedroom and create, you know, amazing compositions, you know, with
Yeah.
zero musical training. Whether or not it's musical is a matter of opinion, but, you know, some of it can be incredibly musical. But the technology has gotten really insane, amazing.
And I did those composition projects with kids and gradually brought more and more computers into it. So by the end, we were working in computer labs. So they each had their own iMac or something and a piano keyboard.
Right.
And these kids were just, you know, they're clicking all over the place, making up really impossibly crazy stuff, but they were having a great time. And some of them were incredibly talented. I mean, it really sparked a whole level of creativity that I don't think they knew about.
No, I had done a number of different things on keyboards and synthesizers, and when you take them to other musicians to play, you know, sometimes you know it's like the trumpet player. So the first thing he says is, "Where do I take a breath?"
Yes. Yeah.
When you're composing on a keyboard, you don't need to.
You don't have to fill in all the measures.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, but that applies to just about every instrument that is an acoustic instrument. Like they have certain limitations that a computer can go beyond. You know, it's like string players have a certain range. Every instrument has a certain range.
But I've had a lot of fun writing stuff, digital stuff. I mean, it's all MIDI. But because it can do anything, go from hot.
You can put a tuba in the piccolo register.
Yeah, and so you get new sounds, new textures, and sometimes it's
which leads to sound design.
So I have a tech question for the two of you, which will lead to the sound design. Yeah. So Finale is a scoring program. Yeah. It's a notation-oriented program, and the other big pile of software is digital audio workstations, DAWs. Right. And the scoring programs have a much easier time with notes, and the DAWs actually produce stuff that sounds better.
Yeah.
So what about this gap between the DAWs and the notation programs? Because it's still a problem right now. The gap's getting narrower, but it's still
getting smaller.
It's an issue.
I work primarily in Pro Tools and have been in the last handful of years learning Sibelius, which is a notation software, and they are both owned by Avid. And they're becoming more and more integrated, where you can do things in one and copy and paste it into the other. But there's still a gap there.
Yeah. Did you end up using digital audio workstations too, or mostly the notation stuff?
You know, I'm really behind the status quo here. I've used Logic every once in a while, but I haven't gotten anything like where you are, Dave, with that kind of stuff. I'm much more note-oriented. I want to see the notes on the page. I want to see, and I can. All right, so it doesn't sound like a clarinet. I know what a clarinet sounds like, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I would like it to sound like a real clarinet or a string section, and sometimes it's okay, but a lot of times it. You know what I mean.
I attended a seminar with a composer a number of years ago. It was the guy that did all the scores for the Star Wars movies.
John Williams?
Was it John Williams?
John Williams, Star Wars, yes.
No, Lord of the Rings.
What's his name?
Anyway, a big name composer, and he was talking about his method, his process, and he was saying that he does it all on paper. You know, he doesn't work with computers. He does it long before he gets to the orchestra. He just sits down and he starts writing, and he hears it all in his head, and that just blows my mind. You know, I mean, I wish I had that ability.
Yeah. I go back and listen to the early pieces that I wrote on pencil and paper, and then I listen to some other ones that I did all digitally and just with more facility electronically. And I say, you know, when I was working from the keyboard, from the piano, and working with the sound as I could hear it in my ears, it's better sound. I mean, the piece is it's a little bit better written because I was conceiving a sound and not hearing something and punching it in.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about sound, and I want you to describe how you got into sound, but I want to ask you a conducting question first. So when you're a conductor and you're dealing with the whole orchestra, you're no longer dealing with one instrument, you're dealing with a lot of different instruments, and they sound different, and they're in different registers. So you need to start to develop your own mental map of the whole orchestra and where it is sonically. So there's these two different kinds of sound. There's the audio engineering sound, and there's the conductor, composer sound, and they're coming together, right? too.
They don't always meet.
Right.
No.
I think engineers hear differently than composers sometimes.
And microphones are not ears.
Yeah,
You know,
that's right.
When you're in an acoustic environment and you're listening to an orchestra or a jazz band or anything, you're hearing the real thing. But and you can set up a microphone and try to emulate the human head. And as an acoustician, you know this very well. You know, you're never going to capture exactly what's happening in that acoustic space. You know, the brain processes what's occurring around it. You know, and microphones they're just picking up an electrical signal and then putting it into either an analog or a digital medium.
So right now the world is becoming very obsessed with spatial media. And, you know, we went from mono, when I first got to Apple, it was 8-bit mono, 8 kilohertz sampling.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, we went up to 16-bit and to 20 kilohertz sampling. But now everybody's starting to figure out how to do the spatial distribution of energy, multi-channels, you know, whether it's 2.1, 5.1, 7.1, 20 channels worth
22.2.6, you know, Atmos. You know, I was in the Dolby Theater in New York City, and they have a 22.4.6, 22 speakers around the room, 4 subwoofers, and 6 speakers overhead to create totally an immersive environment. That brings up an interesting story. A number of years ago in New York City, there was an audio installation at the Cloisters up on the Upper West Side, and this person had recorded a choral piece where there were like 22 different singers. And then she placed 22 different speakers in the room, and she had each singer. She had recorded the singers individually at one at a time in their own space. Then she put those 22 speakers in a room, in a circle, and had each of those voices come out of those individual speakers. And she was trying to create this sense of being immersed in the choir. But for me personally, as an audio engineer, when I walked around, I heard 22 separate voices. It wasn't until I actually left that room and went into an outer room where all of the sound kind of melded and then came through the door that it actually came together and felt like a cohesive thing. You know, are you familiar with that piece?
It was at the Clark Museum a few years ago.
Oh, they
brought it
well?
after the Cloisters. They brought it up to the Clark.
Yeah.
It's 40 parts, 40-part motet by Thomas Tallis.
Oh.
And you stand in front of each speaker and you hear that singer,
That voice,
that voice. But as a moving experience, because you have to move around the room to hear and you start to hear different things that were depending on where you're standing and walking around the room. I found that to be fascinating because you don't get to do that when you're listening to a chorus.
An analogy for me is an acoustic piano versus a sampled piano. Where with an acoustic piano, when you hold down a chord, be it 4, 6, 8, 10 notes, and then you let it reverberate, all of those notes, all of those sounds are interacting with one another and creating harmonic series and upper structure sounds that when you do that on a sampled piano, it's kind of like those individual speakers. All you're getting is the individual discrete sounds, and they're not interacting with one another.
That's right.
So I can't resist, because this is something I'm thinking a lot right now about pianos. And there's between when you go from analog to digital. The two different piles of digital piano approaches are mostly modeling and sampling. And I heard somebody recently say that playing a sampled piano is kind of like a robot playing a real piano, and playing a model piano is kind of like a real person playing a robot. Because the expression capability when it's modeled, it's very, very responsive and expressive, and the transients but it doesn't sound, the tone quality doesn't sound the same as the samples. And how do you think about this as a pianist? Because this is another one of these gaps that has to narrow, just like the DAW and the notation program.
I don't know that gap has to narrow. I like having the distinction between the analog world and the digital world.
No, I don't mean that gap. I mean sampled versus modeled.
Oh, sampled versus modeled. I thought you meant,
no,
digital
that
versus
gap.
acoustic.
No. So Ivory, the sample, they are now introducing combining modeled transients and sampled steady state waveforms, so that you have a hybrid approach to more approximate an instrument which is both responsive and also sounds good. And Roland tried to do this themselves, but so far nobody's actually brought it together. It seems like there's still a war between modeling and sampling.
I'd have to play it. I haven't played a digital piano yet that comes close to an acoustic piano. My favorite digital piano right now is the Yamaha 515. It feels and sounds close enough that I can go on a gig and I can feel like I'm playing a piano.
Saturday you can try my Arturia keyboard driving Piano Tech.
Okay.
With the Bosendorfer model.
Yeah. Okay. And that's got the Fatar action.
Yes.
Yeah. The Fatar makes a nice action.
Yeah. Okay. You guys are leaving me in the dust with all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can actually write on paper. You don't need a computer to write a score.
Yeah.
So it looks like, we could easily go for another half an hour. But it is very interesting how somehow music has this pull, like we doesn't want to let go. And I still prefer my real piano to anything digital in the universe, which is why it's being tuned tomorrow. But the power from a composing point of view of the technology it's so great to be able to try these different registers and so I don't know, maybe we should do this again, because it's an infinite subject. It's
plenty to talk about.
Absolutely.
So thanks, guys. And,
Thank you.
Yeah, because we're in the Berkshires, and this is a little bit of a cultural mecca, even though we sound like we're in the weeds about technology and music, there are a lot of people in the Berkshires who are in the weeds in terms of music and culture and technology, because we're only a couple of hours from Boston from Route 128. And so there are plenty of technical people here, and there are plenty of cultural people here, and a lot of them are the same people. So this program is like perfect for them. Okay, so this is the second part of Harvesting Infinity. Normally, the music is the first part, and the guests are the second part. But this time, I thought I'd just switch it up, because as a jazz musician, I like the idea of improvising. And because the speakers were so interesting that I think they need a little bit follow-up commentary. So I want to talk about some of what the guests said. But before that, just to have a break between the words and the words, I'm going to do some music. So you might be wondering why a guy who's a piano player is playing a ukulele, but it's not really a ukulele, it's really a bass. And since I would never dare to play Miles Davis on a ukulele, but I would on a bass, I'm going to start with a Miles Davis tune called All Blues. And since on this program so far I've only played original music, I apologize for doing a classic, but Miles is cool. So here we go. The sea, the sky, and you and I. The sea, the sky, and you and I. Oh, blues. Oh, colors, shades. old blues. Some folks like blue, some folks like green, some folks like colors that you've never seen. Old blues, old blues. Colors, shades, old blues. Color, shades, old blues. Ba-do-dum-dee, ba-do-dum-dee-doo, ba-do-dum-da, ba-do-dee-dee, ba-do-dum-dee, ba-do-dum-doo, ba-do-dum-da, ba-do-dee-dee. So that was Miles Davis. And what does this have to do with a program called Harvesting Infinity? Well, a lot of things. For one thing, Miles Davis has discovered an enormous number of famous musicians that he picked. And two, he wrote a lot of music that is still played today. So he's definitely one of these Harvesting Infinity kind of guys. He's an innovator. He's creative, slightly nuts, very controversial, just like most innovators are. And now I need to talk about this instrument here, which Shane, who works here as a creative director, turned me on to a month ago during the show. This is a ukulele-sized thing that sounds like a bass-sized thing, except it's 1/10 the size, and it's 1/10 the weight, and it's 1/10 the cost, and it's also 1/10 as loud, which is why I have it plugged into this little Bose sound system over there, because unlike in the days of purely 100% no amplification and electricity, you don't have to get all the sound out of a little body this big. You could plug it into a little speaker, and then this plus that weighs 20 pounds, which is a whole lot less than sticking an acoustic bass into a case. The bass weighs like 30 pounds, the case weighs like 45 pounds, and instead of carrying around this giant thing which requires you to buy a station wagon, you can have a ukulele-sized thing that sounds like a bass, which I think in terms of innovation is like totally off the charts. Thank you, Shane. What a cool thing. He's got a fretless version. I haven't graduated to that yet. So enough of the talk. I'm going to do another piece of music. Since it's really hot out, and it is the summertime, I'm going to do summertime. So from Miles Davis to George Gershwin, hey, most of the stuff I've written is only like 2 years old, and that stuff is like 50 to 80 years old. Well, summertime, and the living is easy. Fish are jumping, and the cotton is high. Oh, your daddy's rich, and your mama, she's good looking. So hush, little baby, don't you cry. One of these mornings, you're gonna rise up singing, and you'll spread your wings. Way up to the sky. Until that morning, there ain't nothing to harm you. With Mammy and Daddy standing by. Well, summertime and the living is easy. A fish are jumping, the cotton is high. Well, your daddy's rich and your mama, she's good looking. Summertime. Okay, I'll just try one more thing before I talk for a while, and this is, I'd call this jazz fusion. I made it up. It's called Sakesly because it's roughly in 6/8 timing, although it sometimes drifts into 4/4 timing. And I have no idea what it's going to be like to try to play bass with this, because this is a song I wrote on the piano. But let's see. Do da ba do dee, ba ba do ba dee ba do dee, do da ba do do, wee wee ba do dee, do da ba do dee, wee ba do dee do 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 da ba do do, wee ba do 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 dee, do da ba da ba dee dee dee, da do ba do da ba do do, do do da ba do da ba do da do. So that's Sakesly, theoretically in 6/8 timing, which this part is, but this part's in 4/4 timing. Fortunately, being an uneducated musician, I don't let these things trouble me, because if you play 6/8 enough measures in a row, and 4/4 enough measures in a row, eventually they wrap around and it'll come out in the same place. But that's only when I'm in math mode. Right now, I'm in music mode. And I think it's time to switch to speaking mode. So let's talk about harvesting infinity. Besides this ukulele bass, which I think is the coolest thing, and Miles Davis, who's quite innovative himself, and George Gershwin, who's just as famous as Miles Davis, maybe even more, I want to talk about these two guys I just had on, one who is a jazz pianist become recording engineer, and another who was a timpani player in an orchestra who became a conductor and ended up writing a bunch of pieces for dancers. But they sort of stuck with music for a really long time. And a few topics came up in their conversation that we had a little bit earlier. One was this big topic of analog versus digital. You know, when I first went to Juilliard, they told me to pretend I didn't know anything about computers, and I should just pick up a pencil and a piece of paper and write music the way that Bach did. Forget about technology, forget about foot pedals, forget about computers, pencil and paper, which kind of horrified me a little bit because I didn't know how to really read and write music that well. But that's one way to learn how to do it. And then I found out that the school was kind of allergic to MIDI, musical instrument digital interfaces, and they didn't like do digital that much. Well, eventually they changed their mind and life has moved forward. But I think a lot of musicians today have been forced to kind of leap over that gap of analog to digital. The pencil and paper is an awful lot slower than using Finale or Sibelius or Dorico on a Mac or a PC. And when you have to write a part for 80 instruments in an orchestra, which I have had to do, to get the orchestra to play it, if you did that on a pencil and paper, forget it. I'd never do it. It takes too long. But with a computer, it still takes a long time, but at least it becomes manageable. So even if you're an analog person and like the sound of analog better and prefer a grand piano to a synthesizer and a real violin to a digital violin, you still end up having to use digital anyway, because if you want to be a musician in today's world, you have to know how to edit a file. You need to know what a WAV file is and an MP3 file and maybe even an AIFF file. And you need to know what filters are and equalization and mastering and editing. No getting around it. If you're going to be a musician today, you're going to have to learn a little bit about technology. And technology has had a tremendous, tremendous impact on musicians. This being one of those examples. How could you get a string bass sound out of a thing that weighs under 3 pounds? But for notation, wow, scoring programs are really cool. But one of the topics that came up in the conversation with David and Dave was that the notation programs, although the notes look really good, they don't sound really good. Whereas the digital audio workstations like Logic and Pro Tools, they sound really good. So you still have this gap between writing music and playing music, and it persists today, which is why most musicians end up learning both. They end up learning how to use notation programs, and they also end up learning how to use digital audio workstations. And there's no getting around it. You're going to have to become somewhat technically proficient if you're going to be a musician today. You can't just pretend that you have a pencil and paper. The gap between these digital audio workstations, like Logic and Pro Tools, and notation programs like Sibelius and Finale, it's shrinking. You're starting to be able to get better sounds out of the notation programs and more scoring out of the digital audio workstations. There's still a gap, which is why most professional musicians actually know how to use both. Never mind having to cross the gap between analog and digital, you also have to do digital and digital, scoring programs versus workstations. And that brings up another topic that came up in the conversation, which is close to my heart as a jazz pianist, which is the difference between a real piano and a digital piano. And is the digital piano a freestanding unit that has keys and speakers and all that? Or is it a slab of electronics that has to plug into a sound system? Or is it a MIDI controller that you plug into your computer and your Macintosh makes all of the sounds? They all sound really different. They all cost different amounts of money. They all have different amounts of technical complexity. And being a musician who's also a physicist and an engineer, I fell into being a nerd in all three categories and had to pursue the diminishing returns of trying all of them. And this started a really long time ago because I noticed this thing. I noticed that all of the musicians in an orchestra or in a band, when they went to do a gig, they were bringing with them the same instrument that they had practiced on, that they were familiar with, except for the piano player. The piano player showed up at the club and some of the keys didn't work and other ones were out of tune and it didn't feel the same. And I wondered, why is it that every other musician in the world, except for the piano player, gets to bring their own instrument? And well, it was pretty simple. Pianos weigh between 400 and 800 pounds. That's why. So even though I did once take to the streets with a pickup truck and an upright piano in the back of the pickup truck and drove around, had somebody else drive around while I played, it's very suboptimal from a logistical standpoint. So this led me to go to college for 10 years to study physics, electrical engineering, electroacoustics, acoustics, and digital signal processing to find out how to make a digital piano. Because when I was playing these gigs in 1975, there were no digital pianos. And I naively thought, well, I'll figure out how to do it and I'll build one. Well, 10 years later, and a lot of college, I eventually ended up at Bose Corporation, supposedly as a speaker designer, where I talked them into letting me build the world's first integrated digital piano, which had the speakers, the amplifiers, the equalization, the keyboard, the sounds. This was in around 1982. They let me start. By around 1985, we shipped a product. In between then, Yamaha and Technics copied my design at a trade show in Japan where the president of Bose Japan showed up my model. So I've been in this digital piano business since the very beginning, being the first one who made a integrated digital piano. And it was called the Ensoniq Bose Acoustic Wave Piano. And I still have two of them in my garage, as a matter of fact. That was in the mid-'80s, which is 40 years ago. And the debates are still going on about why do you want to have a digital piano? Well, it's lighter, it's more portable, but you can plug it into a computer. And there are still big debates going on between the companies that make the dedicated hardware and younger people who all use their laptop to make all the piano sounds, and they just plug in a controller. I don't know who's wrong or who's right, because I actually am old enough that I've done all of them and have all of them and have more musical instruments in my house than makes sense to have. But just like if over 40 years you only gain 1 pound a year, at the end of 40 years you're 40 pounds overweight. Well, if you only accumulate one musical instrument a year, after 40 years, you have a lot of instruments. Even if you give some away, even if you sell some, even if you fill up your garage, you still have a lot of instruments. And being a nerd, nerds are not only technical nerds like engineers or computer people, they're music nerds too. And they're sports nerds too. Nerds are anybody who spends such a diminishing amount of effort on something that it seems crazy to everybody else. And guess what? To get really good at music or at sports or at science or anything, you end up having to become a nerd, at least for some amount of time. You could rejoin the rest of the human race once you've put your 10,000 hours or more in and gotten good at it. But near as I can tell, all of the really accomplished creative people I know are nerds. They do pursue diminishing returns. And it gets them into trouble with the rest of the world because these nerds have a very annoying set of tendencies. We tend to create new models of the way things should be and not necessarily accept the old models. Now, this program is called Harvesting Infinity. It's about innovation, innovators, innovation relationships. All of those people are creative outliers. They all create their own models. They all don't follow the status quo. They all do their own thing. They're all nerds, or at least have been nerds for part of their life. And here's a question I'd like to ask all of you. If you know a bunch of creative outliers, what I bet you do, because this is the Berkshires and it's a cultural mecca, have you noticed that these creative outliers have more energy than normal people? Because if you're trying to do anything new, it's going to take more energy than if you just do the same old thing that everybody was doing before, and then you have to convince people that you're not nuts. So it does take energy to do this. And I've noticed that most of the creative outliers I encounter do have a lot of energy, and they also have a lot of security because they're willing to rock the boat, and they know that if they mess up and it doesn't work, which happens frequently, that they can recover and do it again. So these are my favorite people, the outliers who are willing to rock the boat, create a new model, do something different. There are other people who are very attached to their models and their map of the territory and don't want to change at all. They tend to not like people who are ultra creative because we're annoying. We change the balance of power. We change who might be in charge. We changed the way of doing things. When I got to Bose and convinced them to switch from only being an analog company to digital, it took 10 years. They didn't want to do it. But I persisted, and eventually it happened. And when I got to Apple, computers had no speakers and microphones. And that took about 5 years to convince everybody that maybe computers ought to have speakers and microphones. Surprising, isn't it? You would have thought that was obvious, but it was different. And people don't want to do stuff that's different. So harvesting infinity is about those people who are able to harvest infinity, which always occurs from doing something different. You can't harvest infinity from the same old stuff. The same old stuff has a linear, hierarchical, logical, rational model, and it definitely is based on scarcity. The infinity people, the creative outliers, they are nonlinear. They are not strictly logic-based. They take a lot of chances, and they are willing to get into trouble. So this program is really for people like that. I know I'm never going to convince people who are attached to perfecting the past to be willing to enter the future. They're not going to do it. They're going to try to drag us back to the past, but it won't work. Because guess what? The past isn't there anymore. So they can't go back there. No matter how many speeches or elections or rigs, you can't get to a place that doesn't exist anymore. The past isn't there anymore. So forward is what this whole program, Harvesting Infinity, is about. The people who are willing to move forward, make changes, take risks, and become change agents. And this can make it difficult for our spouses, because when their friends say to them, so what's your husband doing? They go, well, I get accused of being a professional shit disturber, which I wear proudly and may not even be able to be broadcast, but hey, calling a spade a spade. So here's the next question. Besides having more energy than normal, if you're going to be creative, and having more security than normal, because you're going to fail and take chances, I wonder, is it causal or is it correlated? Meaning, do people who have more security and more energy have more of a willingness to be creative? Or do people who really want to be creative have to somewhere find the energy and the security to do it? I don't really know, but I know that most of my creative outlier friends do not entirely live in the same physical universe as everybody else. We seem to pull energy out of the air, which is the harvesting infinity part of it. And we seem to have more energy. And just like the three guys who were just at the table earlier, you'd never believe that one of them was almost 80. And most people don't believe that I'm over 70. Creative people tend to age a little more slowly. Maybe we update our models and our roadmaps of what's going on in the world and change because we're not as attached to hanging on to the way it was. If you don't want to stop growing and you want to live longer, you might want to let go of holding on to the models of the way it used to be and be willing to take some chances. And that means you're going to need some energy, so you better get a good night's rest too, because it takes a lot of energy to let go of what exists and then try to embrace something new. And speaking of energy, here's another hypothesis. Now, energy is something that's pretty scarce in the world, and humans have evolved to really maximize their energy. That's why a lot of us overeat, because food used to be scarce. So when we see it, like, we eat it, because 30,000 years ago, it was hard to pass up a meal. Well, we create models in part because our systems are lazy and we want to preserve energy. So instead of driving to work every day the same way, when you get to the corner that you recognize because it has the big bush and you make the right turn, we do all these things automatically. We create habits, we create models. We sometimes confuse the map for the territory because we're so busy saving energy doing the thing that saved us energy. Now, if you do that to excess, then you don't move forward and you tend to be less happy. If you do it to excess, then you're accused of not being very grounded or convergent or normal. So managing the balance between how much energy you have and how much creativity you expend, it's difficult. So for example, I play a lot of different musical instruments, and people started asking me when I was 16, so make up your mind. Are you a saxophonist or a bass player or a guitar player or a piano player or a singer or a sax player? I said, well, why do I have to make up my mind? Is it because there isn't enough time to do all of them? I said, what if I do all of them, but it just takes me an extra 20 years to get there, which is actually what happened. But it turned out I had more energy than normal, which made it easier to make audacious goals like that. Like, hey, let's learn how to play all of them. And like, well, why do we have to copy these other bands? Can we just make up all of our own music and be completely original? And that takes more energy too, but it is more rewarding. And I think that's what the harvesting infinity thing is about. When we are those creative people who go out into the ozone and make our own way, somehow we get meaning out of that. It is meaningful for creative people to create. They don't create because somebody told them to create or because somebody said, well, we'll pay you more money if you're creative. Usually creative people get negative feedback, not positive feedback. But we do it anyway because it feeds into our identity, who we think we are, it gives us meaning, and we're happier. So essentially, those of us who harvest infinity and who are creative outliers, we do it because we want to, because it feels good. And yes, there may be an energy penalty. Okay. Still, the people with the best mental models end up winning. The ones who have the obsolete deficient models, they lose. The ones with the updated modern models, they win. So I just want to encourage everybody, take the chance, be a change agent, be a champion, find meaning, and don't listen to what the rest of the world says when you come up with a great idea and they go, well, why would we need that? Or if that could have been done, we would have done it already because we're smart. Don't listen. If you are going to be creative, you have to get into the habit of not listening some of the time. This is especially true when you're younger, when people say, well, do all these things that society wants you to do and you will be happy. You won't. If you are creative and you want to do different things and you do everything that everybody tells you to do, you will not be happy. You actually have to do what you want to do. And that's about the end of this 30 minutes, since we've only got 7 seconds left. I'm done.